Thank you all for joining us here this afternoon. This past weekend, as people were coming back to Seattle, and Seattle was enjoying its nightlife, Seattle saw one of the worst late night, early morning of violence in recent memory. Over the weekend, we had several separate and unrelated incidents that erupted into gunfire that killed 5 people and injured 9 people. Mothers lost their children, families lost their fathers, people lost their friends. Our communities were shaken in a series of avoidable gun violence incidents. This weekend delivered a sober reminder that Seattle is not immune from gun violence. This is a national crisis. Over the past week, from Chicago to Minneapolis to Washington, D.C., there have been over 900 shooting incidents. 900. These tragic events have happened at national baseball games, during the Minneapolis Bucks celebration event, and here in Seattle outside of popular nightclubs in the heart of historic downtown neighborhood. The victims, like I said, have been family members, loved ones, friends, children, parents. This level of gun violence in Seattle and our country cannot become the new normal. Just this past week, I announced a number of upstream prevention measures that the city is moving forward on to address the roots of gun violence and reimagining public safety in our community, including more than $10 million to fund 33 trusted community-led safety programs, $30 million in investments recommended by our Equitable Communities Task Force to address the disparities that are impacting communities of color. This legislation is sitting and awaiting a proviso leaf at City Council. We announced a plan for a new specialized triage response team and the expansion of SPD's very successful Community Service Officer program, and $2 million to invest in a regional peacekeeping collective to deliver the wraparound case management and family-centered engagement that we know can help disrupt the cycle of gun violence. Together, these investments will help to create a multi-pronged strategy in our region. But it has to be multi-pronged. We have to take guns off the street through SPD and other federal partners and other programs. We have to invest in community-led solutions. We have to create a support system for young people at risk of gun violence and appropriately hold accountable individuals accountable for their acts of violence. And that's not enough. Even as we look to ramp up alternatives to sworn officers' response and prevention, this past weekend serves as a reminder. There are many times and types of 911 calls that require a traditional sworn police officer to respond. We saw this weekend street racing, nightlife-related altercations, firearm incidents, other life-threatening emergencies that require the response of an armed police officer. SPD officers and first responders quickly responded to secure separate scenes in different parts of our city and provide aid over this weekend. When people called 911 across the city this weekend, they expected a fast response. But nearly every officer in our city aided in the response to the incidents we saw, while continuing to address urgent 911 calls. I will have the chief discuss in greater detail the response and staffing challenges that SPD faces. But as a city, we cannot continue on this current trajectory of losing police officers like we have this year into the next years. Over the past 17 months, the Seattle Police Department has lost 250 police officers, which is the equivalent of over 300,000 service hours. We're on path to losing 300 officers. We are creating meaningful alternatives, but as I said last year, the city has an obligation to still continue constitutional policing and respond to 911 calls. Not unexpected, losing these number of officers. When city leaders talk about cutting a department by 50%, you will lose employees. Families need security. Workers, even police officers, need working conditions that support them. We cannot just cut. We need a plan, a comprehensive plan that addresses both prevention and intervention, but at the same time provides adequate number of police officers. In recent months, Chief Diaz has been working on a plan to ensure continued public safety in our city that recognizes SPD's current budget, including out-of-order layoffs as proposed by Council has admitted cannot occur. In August, I will send down an ordinance to City Council to promote more alternatives to 911 calls and address the urgent staffing crisis, including options to recruit qualified police officers quickly, to ensure that SPD has adequate staffing levels to keep our communities safe at the agreed-upon staffing levels in the 2021 budget. It is a false choice between community-led solutions and police officers. We need both. And we need a plan to stand up those alternatives in a way that they can deliver on what communities need. As short-term steps, Chief Diaz is making some staffing adjustments to ensure more officers are able to respond during those key hours. We're also going to engage with businesses and nightlife districts to discuss safety planning, as we've seen increase in public safety challenges around our nightlife establishments, not just locally, but nationwide. We'll also continue to accelerate hiring and the retention of good officers. I'll say it again, there is more that needs to be done to address gun violence in our communities. There is no one-size solution to this crisis, but the widespread availability of firearms in our nation is feeding this violence. The inaction of our state and federal partners to address the epidemic of gun violence at this time only adds fuel to the fire. Until this is treated like the public health crisis that it is, people will continue to lose their lives and our communities will continue to suffer. I now will hand it off to Chief Diaz, who can go through an update on this weekend's events, but I want to close this as well. We saw last year so many voices in the street demanding community alternatives to policing, to bring attention to the systemic racism that has impacted communities of color, particularly the black community, for generations. Make no mistake about it, this gun violence is also disproportionately impacting those communities of color. We need to stand with communities and with mothers and with families and find a way to stop the census violence. And that, I'll turn it over to the Chief.
Thank you, Mayor. Good afternoon. Late last week, Mayor Durkand and I stood outside Harborview Medical Center, where most shooting victims in Seattle are taken for life-saving treatment. And we talked about the city and King County's new community-based efforts to help stop the rise in gun violence. Then Friday night, a man was shot and killed in the Roosevelt neighborhood. Yesterday morning, at least 8 people were shot across the city. 3 people died and at least 5 were wounded. Overnight, another victim was shot and killed. That's a total of 5 homicides this weekend. And then again this morning, shots rang out at an encampment along Yesler. At last update, the victim was receiving medical care at Harborview Medical Center. The violence is all over Seattle, from Roosevelt to Belltown, to Pioneer Square, to the Chinatown International District, to Capitol Hill, to Lake City. And the bloodshed is proof. Criminals with guns are not someone else's problem. This is a city-wide crisis that impacts all of us. Far too many families are grieving the death of loved ones today, and this violence must stop. Our city is experiencing the highest number of shots fired in recent history, and just a few weeks ago we had over 24 shots fired in a week alone. We've seen more than a 40% increase in shots fired this year compared to the same time last year, and we've seen more than a 100% increase in drive-by shootings year over year. And this year alone, we've recovered close to 2,000 shell casings. Even with diminished police resources, our officers have been exhaustively working every gun violence incident because every shot fired by a criminal with a weapon is an attack against our entire community. And we do have diminished resources. I have 115 fewer officers in patrol than I did just a year ago. I have 38 fewer detectives to follow up on reported crime. And as the mayor said, we almost are losing over 300 officers over the last 2 years. This is forcing tough choices, and I'm down a remarkable number of officers and I have a reduced and restricted budget. I'm having to make tough choices where essentially my hands are tied between having enough officers to respond to multiple scenes of violence across the city and having officers staff special events and other low priority events. It should be no surprise that the clear choice, I must have officers responding to shots fired throughout the city, provide medical emergency aid like tourniquets and wound packing, interview witnesses, gather evidence, and hopefully make it possible to hold people accountable. But I don't always have enough officers to handle the events and violence that is occurring and covering these events. So far this year, more than 5 days a week, on average, we're having to go to priority call statuses, where we focus exclusively on priority 1 calls, and priority 2 if there is time. I need more officers, and that will take time, but I'm going to do all we can with the support of the mayor to get our hiring where it needs to be. We're seeking good response rates to our hiring tests, but there also requires making it clear to officers, current and prospective, that we will have their support, or that they will have our support, financially and otherwise, to do this job well, and know it will not be laid off because of budget cuts. Until those officers are brought on, we're going to need to bridge a gap on technology, and we have proposed a slew of projects that have shown effectiveness in other cities to help, but we also need partners. I've spoken even this morning with our federal partners, and they've all pledged to do what they can, but we also need our community to help us. We need to make sure that we're getting these guns out of the hands of people wanting to do harm. We need legal gun owners to keep their firearms locked up and safe so they can't be stolen and used to commit dangerous criminal acts. We need everyone to encourage friends and family to put down their weapons and find other ways to address concerns and resolve their issues. Make no mistake, this is a gun violence crisis. As police officers and public servants, we can't do everything. Lessening the devastation that is happening in our streets and our homes is not something SPD can do alone, and this is something we all need to do together. And thank you.
Thank you, Chief. Either the chief or I can take questions.
Mayor, it's no coincidence perhaps that these new police reform bills went into effect over the weekend. Do you feel that this, maybe perhaps for the chief, is giving a perception to the public that police won't answer or police won't pursue?
No, I think we've made it very clear, and the chief has made it clear, is that the Seattle Police Department is going to respond to the best of its ability, and that the reforms that the state legislature passed to the greatest extent were things we were already doing in Seattle. And so there are still issues there that need to be resolved. We need a model policy, for example, that's not going to be for a year from now. And so in between this interviewing year, what to do. But make no mistake about it. The Seattle Police Department is responding to incidents. They're doing everything they can to respond to every type of incident, and they will continue to do so. But they also will make sure that they use the policies and procedures that have been put in place to de-escalate appropriately, to do everything possible to make sure that our constitutional policing is in not just officers here, but it's a key part of who we're recruiting. When we say we need more officers, we're not just filling up the department. We're still making sure that we get officers who are going to be committed to the highest level of policing for the community. Thank you.
I might add. So even as Sunday night or Sunday morning, within the first shooting, we actually responded to a fight disturbance, broke everything up. So officers had responded out to the scene. Just a short time later, that's when the first shooting happened in the Belltown area. 45 minutes later, so that creates a significant response. Then a short time later, within 45 minutes, the second shooting with 2 dead and other victims, with the crime scene being almost 2 blocks along. An hour later, another shooting happened in the CID. Very shortly thereafter, we had another shooting in Cal Anderson. That we had to take literally every resource throughout this, extend third watch, bring first watch in early. So every officer is going out and doing the hard work that they need to do.
Chief, do you happen to have the
will get that to you. But I do know, I think it's like 1:38 in the morning is when the first shooting occurred on that Sunday. So, and then it's like 2:32. So we'll make sure to get you all that information.
Chief, you mentioned the gun violence across the country. I know down in Portland, the FBI is working with the Portland Police Bureau. Are there any plans to bring any kind of federal agency to the ground here in Seattle?
Yeah, actually, we've been working on Project Save Neighborhoods and others with FBI, ATF. We just did a recent operation that resulted in 19 search warrants, 50 guns recovered July 1st. So that was, one of the things that we've been working with them. But they are committed to continuing to be partners. They're committed to addressing those that are really focused on harming our communities and preying on our communities. And so we are currently working with them right now.
Can you say more about the street racing? Has that been a problem recently, and what was happening that day?
Yeah, so on Friday night, King County Sheriffs had responded to a street racing that occurred in around 155th in Aurora. As they broke that up, one of the vehicles had left the scene, driving down into the Seattle area, and had done a U-turn, and when they were speeding back up, hit a semi, and that would cause a collision, which was a DOA at that time. So we were handling a shooting scene in the Roosevelt neighborhood, and then had to have our traffic collision investigations unit respond out and handle a traffic death as well. So all within about a 30-minute period. So if you can imagine, the north end was using all of their resources just within about 30 minutes, which makes it very difficult to be able to respond to just basic 911 calls or other things that are going on in the north end.
Mayor Durkand, you mentioned you would be interested in putting legislation forward in August at the council to free up other officers. Or do you plan to fund programs like the LEAD program, or what are other details of that?
Yeah, we have a comprehensive plan we're putting forward. We talked about some of it on Friday. We're, creating this new triage entity. We want to make sure that we hire additional CSOs. We're looking to also pay things like because more officers left, the amount of severance pay is higher than we expected. So there's some that are administrative, but we're trying to create programs in this space that actually can be responsive to community emergencies. In the RFP that we put out for $10 million, we got some great proposals back, and we will be funding some really important community-based initiatives, but none of them replace response to 911. Even they said that. And so when a person from Seattle calls 911 when they're a business or resident and they need a response, we have to have a response ready. We're hoping to build up those responses that aren't police officers to those kinds of calls where you don't need a police officer. But there are calls where you need a police officer to respond.
Mayor, you mentioned some of this money going to these community programs to ideally prevent gun violence. I've heard from some folks that say that money, it takes a while to produce results, real results. What can be done in the short term that's feasible and does produce results and takes guns off the street?
So it's the comprehensive approach that is going to actually get the best results, both short term and long term. These community-based programs do take time. I mean, you've got to build up the capacity, and you have to build up those programs to really get to the prevention part of this. You have to have credible messengers who can get in and work with community to really deter the violence in the beginning. And then you need the services for community that is stricken by that. And it has to work hand in glove with building opportunity from the moment that a child is born all the way through. On the law enforcement side, it's why we're looking at things like not just a police response, but Health One. If we get a call and there's a low acuity call, instead of a police officer going to that scene, we can have Health One go, and then the police officer that normally would go is freed up to respond to an emergency event. The same with the triage unit or the CSOs. They can respond to those calls where you don't need an armed police officer, and that gives the armed police officers more flexibility to respond to the calls where they're really needed.
Those sound more, reactive. In the short term, though, what can be done to maybe stop those calls from coming in the first place?
The number one thing is community. Community has to be the first voice that says we won't take this violence and works themselves to stop the violence in this community. Second is we got to get more guns off the street, and we're doing that. We are taking a record number of guns off the street in the city of Seattle, but if you look at the crimes, the chief can give you the exact data, but many of these shootings are happening with stolen guns. Omari.
Ma'am, you just mentioned community, and community playing a big part of this. The community is represented by the council members that are elected in office. How close is the city council, maybe working with your office or with Chief Diaz to around messaging on this issue here of gun violence? You know, we've been tracking them for a while, and it's been fairly silent from city council chambers, but I'm just, you know, that's the public facing, maybe private facing, that you guys are aligning around some kind of consistent messaging that's going out here around activating community and getting really all the citizens of Seattle to actually care about what's going on.
You know, I'm cautiously optimistic that we can get there, Omari, but I can't wait. And it's not just messaging, it's action. That's what we need. And, you know, I've been trying to meet with families and community groups to try to see what we can do on all these efforts. From the, you know, the Equitable Communities Initiative Task Force that is really investing in things like generational wealth and healthcare, access to affordable housing, which are the things that show and really build resilient, safe communities. But I will continue to work with and on this issue because this level of gun violence is unacceptable. We need everybody in the fight, and I need City Council standing up and saying that the community should not have this level of violence, and we will work to make sure that we not just build up the community resilience needed, but we also make sure that when people call 911, if and when you need a police officer, one can respond. Thank you.